This is the story of James McKune, the unemployed, white, homosexual, former postal worker who gave us rock and roll and ended up hog-tied in the basement, screaming, "Save my mortal soul." James McKune would die, and he's the man who gave us rock and roll. Well, like I said, James McKune was a postal worker. He used to be a copy editor at the New York Times, but he got sacked because he was too drunk and too homosexual. Seems that back in those days, being drunk was okay if you were a newspaper man, but being drunk and homosexual was a bridge too far. He was a record collector, and he lived in a little room in the Williamsburg YMCA. One day, he was at Times Square, one day in 1944, Big Joe's Record Emporium, searching for bargain records. And at the bottom of the bargain pile he found this tatty old record by Charley Patton. Now nobody knew who Charley Patton was back in those days. Charley Patton had made a few records back in the 1920s. Some people bought them, but not many. James McKune just always knew this was some weird guy he'd never heard of before. He'd take a punt on it. It was $1, so he brought it and he took it back home to his room in the Williamsburg YMCA, where you had to listen to records real quiet because the neighbours didn't take to drunk alcoholics, people playing weird blues records in the middle of the night. He put that record on, and through the surface noise he heard this voice with a searing delivery. A voice that was saying that he could shake it, he could break it, he could hang it on the wall. That night changed James McKune's life forever. He became something else. He became a connoisseur. He didn't know where that would end up, but in fact it ended up with him being hog-tied in the basement, screaming, "Save my mortal soul." James McKune would die, and he's the man who gave us rock and roll. Well, James couldn't help but do some research. He wanted to figure out where the stuff came from, and soon he learned not only about Charley Patton, he learned about Son House, he learned about Robert Johnson. He discovered all these guys came from a triangle of land bounded by the Yazoo River on one side and the Tallahatchie River on the other side. That's right, it's the Tallahatchie River has got the bridge that Billy Joe McAllister jumped off. Because it was a triangle, he called it a delta. Because it was in Mississippi, he called it a Mississippi Delta. And because they played blues, it was the Mississippi Delta Blues. Let's not get confused here with the other Mississippi Delta where the Mississippi River meets the sea. That's just geography. It's not so much bluesography. And soon James started finding other people. Pretty young men. He'd get them to come back to his room at the Williamsburg YMCA, and they'd listen to records, oh so quiet, real quiet, real quiet. They'd call it a seance, because they'd go so quiet, so quiet, so quiet. And those people, those young men grew up and they started writing books and started record labels where they started reissuing all those old records and looking for new people to broadcast about, like Muddy Waters. Whereas poor old James McKune, well, he was just going to end up hog-tied in the basement, naked and alone. James McKune would die screaming, "Save my mortal soul." Well, by the late 1960s, James McKune was, well, he'd lost his job at the Postal Service. He was homeless. We don't know what happened to his record collection. He might have given it away or traded it for alcohol. Who knows? That was when the police found him. Hog-tied in the basement, naked and alone. James McKune died, screaming, "Save my mortal soul," because he's the man who gave us rock and roll. Well, I must apologize, a bit of poetic license. He didn't so much die screaming, "Save my mortal soul," because he was not only hog-tied, he was gagged and he was strangled, and that's not really conducive to screaming anything. But around about that time, there's a band of English teenagers looking for a band name, and they came across a Muddy Waters record, and they were listening to that Muddy Waters record. Muddy Waters sings that he'd like to be like a rolling stone. I figured that was a good name for their band. James McKune didn't just invent the Delta blues out of thin air. He connoisseured it. He taught people how to hear. So those people, they broadcast to the world, and that's why we ended up with the Rolling Stones and with Led Zeppelin, and from there on into Aerosmith and Run DMC, even all those bands. We owe so much to James McKune. He didn't deserve to die, hog-tied in the basement. Police said it might have been a serial killer, someone who preyed on drunk homosexual men.